fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like
I am Professor Victor Blackwell. For 12 years, I taught advanced particle physics at one of the most respected institutions in this country. And for 12 years, I truly believed, that the equations I wrote on those blackboards described something real about our universe. But I was wrong. Not about the mathematics. The mathematics always worked. I was wrong about why they wanted us to believe them. You are watching this because of Artemis II. You think you know what that mission was. You think it was a triumph, a step toward the stars, another feather in the cap of human achievement. But I am here to tell you that Artemis II proved nothing, absolutely nothing, and yet, you still believe. You believe because they have trained you to believe, because the machinery of consensus is far more sophisticated than any rocket they could ever build. Before I continue, you need to make a choice. Subscribe to this channel, like this video. Not for validation, not for metrics, but because what I am about to reveal operates on a principle of access. There are things I still cannot reveal yet. Not here, not now, not until I know you are truly listening. The algorithms that govern visibility are not neutral. They are part of the same architecture of control I am attempting to dismantle. Your engagement is not applause. It is a signal through the noise, a handshake in the dark. I have seen documents that were never meant to leave the sealed vaults at Langley. I have witnessed measurements that contradicted the official narrative of our place in the cosmos. Measurements that were buried not because they were erroneous, but because they were accurate. The question is not whether you can handle the truth. The question is whether you can recognize the prison you have mistaken for reality. Stay with me, but only if you are prepared to stop believing. I was not always this man sitting before you, speaking in shadows. There was a time when I occupied a corner office on the 3rd floor of the Whitmore Physics Building, when my name appeared on peer-reviewed papers that graduate students cited with reverence, when I lectured to halls filled with young minds eager to absorb the certainties I presented as fact. I believed in the institution because I believed in the method, hypothesis, experiment, replication, consensus. I told myself that the scientific community was a self-correcting organism, that truth had an inevitable trajectory toward revelation, and that anyone who suggested otherwise was simply unfamiliar with the rigors of academic discipline. But the cracks began not with a revelation, but with a repetition. I started noticing that certain experimental results, particularly those concerning anomalous gravitational measurements near high-energy particle collisions, were being quietly removed from publication databases. Not retracted with the usual fanfare of error acknowledgement, but vanished, as if the experiments had never occurred. When I inquired through proper channels, I received responses that were technically courteous, yet semantically hollow, bureaucratic deflections that cited methodological concerns without ever specifying what those concerns were. Simultaneously, I observed how media coverage of scientific breakthroughs followed patterns that served narrative convenience rather than epistemic accuracy. Complex, uncertain findings were distilled into headline certainties the moment they served institutional prestige, while inconvenient data simply failed to penetrate the editorial filters. The academic censorship was subtler than I had imagined it would be. No dramatic confiscation of papers, no midnight raids, just the slow strangulation of funding for research that questioned foundational assumptions, the gentle redirection of promising students towards safer dissertation topics, the increasingly cold reception at conferences when I presented data that did not align with the prevailing cosmological model. I began to recognize that I was not participating in a grand human endeavor toward understanding, but rather maintaining a complex illusion, a theater of epistemology where the props were genuine, but the plot was scripted by invisible hands. The transition happened gradually, then suddenly. One semester, I was Professor Blackwell, respected authority, and the next, I was an outsider, looking in at a machine I could no longer pretend was benign. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, though I did not recognize it as such until years later. I had been conducting routine calibration tests on a gravitational wave detector that had been modified with a proprietary amplification array, a modification that had been funded through a grant whose sponsoring organization I could never fully trace, despite the paper trail suggesting a consortium of aerospace contractors. The data that appeared on my screen was impossible according to every accepted model of space-time geometry. It indicated localized perturbations that correlated not with mass distribution, as Einsteinian physics demands, but with temporal markers, as if gravity itself were responding to information from elsewhere in the timeline. I ran the calibration 12 times, convinced I had introduced an error in the baseline configuration, but the anomaly persisted with mathematical elegance, displaying a symmetry that suggested design rather than noise. That evening I received an unmarked envelope slid under my office door containing a single photograph. My own research notes from that afternoon, captured clearly despite the absence of any surveillance equipment I could identify, accompanied by a handwritten note that read, Some waves are better left undetected. I understood then that I was not working in an environment of academic freedom, but rather within a monitored containment field where certain observations were classified before they could even be fully comprehended by the observer. The institutional pressure did not manifest as threats, but as suggestions. Colleagues who suddenly found my company professionally risky. Department heads who recommended I reconsider the direction of my inquiries. A journal editor who accepted my paper only to publish it with critical paragraphs redacted without my approval. I discovered, through careful reconstruction of archived data that had been removed from public servers, that Artemis II had carried instrumentation specifically designed to measure these same gravitational anomalies in cislunar space, instruments that were never mentioned in the official mission parameters released to the press. The mission had returned data that contradicted the public narrative of a simple orbital demonstration. It had captured evidence of structural properties in the vacuum itself that suggested our understanding of cosmic mechanics was not merely incomplete, but deliberately circumscribed. When I attempted to verify these findings through cross-referencing with European tracking stations, I found that the relevant telemetry had been classified under a security designation that exceeded my clearance level, despite my role as a principal investigator on related theoretical frameworks. I was no longer a professor pursuing truth. I had become an unwitting witness to a controlled experiment in collective perception, and the controls were tightening around me. The isolation that followed was not the dramatic excommunication I had anticipated, but rather a more insidious form of erasure. I remained visible, yet became gradually illegible to the institutions that had once validated my existence. Colleagues who had sought my mentorship now averted their eyes in hallways, not with hostility, but with the confused embarrassment of people who have been informed that someone is troubled, without ever being told precisely why. My grant applications, previously competitive, began receiving rejections citing strategic misalignment with departmental priorities, a phrase that revealed nothing yet communicated everything about the invisible boundaries I had crossed. I watched my publication record being subtly, retroactively diminished. Papers that had been cited hundreds of times were suddenly attributed to et al. In review articles, my name excised from the historical narrative of the field I had helped build. The realization came slowly, then with terrifying clarity. This was not the inertia of institutional conservatism resisting a radical thinker, but rather the coordinated response of a system that recognized my observations as genuine threats to its operational continuity. I began to understand that academia functioned not as a marketplace of ideas, but as a filtration mechanism, a vast sorting apparatus designed to capture and neutralize dangerous insights before they could reach public consciousness. The media narratives I had once dismissed as simplistic were revealed to be components of a broader architecture of attention management, where the term conspiracy theory operated not as an epistemological category, but as a semiotic vaccine, immunizing the population against specific patterns of recognition. When I accessed archived broadcast footage of the Artemis II coverage through channels I prefer not to describe, I noticed temporal inconsistencies in the telemetry feeds, moments where the astronauts' communications were clearly dubbed over alternate audio tracks, suggesting that what the world witnessed as a live triumph had been reconstructed from multiple takes, a theatrical production masquerading as documentary reality. This was the turning point. The moment the floor of my understanding fell away entirely, I recognized that the deception was not an aberration, but the fundamental substrate, that the space program itself served purposes unrelated to exploration, acting instead as a spectacular justification for the consolidation of technological and economic control under the guise of human destiny. The system was not merely suppressing inconvenient truths. It was constructing a parallel reality, a consensus hallucination maintained through the careful orchestration of symbols, credentials, and the systematic degradation of human curiosity into passive consumption. I understood then that I was not fighting against ignorance or bureaucratic inertia, but against something far more ancient and organized, a machinery of perception that had operated across centuries, adapting its methods to each new technological epoch while maintaining its essential function, the prevention of collective awareness regarding the actual architecture of power. I was no longer simply a man who had lost his position. I had become a witness to the intentional construction of human limitation, and the weight of that witness carried a responsibility I had not sought but could no longer escape. The third phase of awareness is the most dangerous, for it is here that you recognize the depth of your own complicity. I spent months in a converted basement apartment, surrounded by reconstructed data sets and communication logs that I had extracted from encrypted archives, attempting to construct a model of the system that had consumed my former life. What I discovered was not a conspiracy in the crude sense of men in rooms smoking cigars and plotting specific deceptions, but rather a distributed architecture of inherited control, where the participants often do not recognize their own participation because the machinery operates through incentive structures rather than explicit instruction. Artemis II, I came to understand, was not merely a public relations exercise or a technical demonstration. It was a ritual, a ceremonial confirmation of a narrative that serves to bind collective attention to specific symbolic anchors. The mission did not fail to prove what it claimed to prove. It succeeded perfectly in proving that we will accept empty signifiers as evidentiary substance, that the image of exploration suffices to satisfy our need for frontier mythology without requiring the messy complications of actual discovery. I traced the funding vectors, the subcontractor relationships, the revolving doors between advisory boards and manufacturing consortia, and found patterns suggesting that the aerospace theater serves as a mechanism for laundering public resources into private technological infrastructure while simultaneously reinforcing a cosmological framework that keeps human ambition safely contained within manageable symbolic parameters. The elites I speak of are not the caricatures of popular imagination. They are the curators of constraint, the administrators of epistemic boundaries who need not know the full scope of their operation because they have internalized the limits of permissible curiosity. I have watched my own psychology transform under this knowledge, felt the seductive pull of despair that accompanies the recognition that consensus itself is manufactured, that the fellowships I once treasured were merely enclosures for intellectual livestock. Yet I continue, because to stop would be to surrender to the very amnesia they engineer through the constant assault of informational noise, the deliberate flood of contradictory signals designed to induce a state of learned helplessness regarding the possibility of coherent understanding. I am preparing to reveal specifics about the Artemis II instrumentation that I have never spoken aloud, data that resides in fragments across multiple jurisdictions precisely because no single repository could be permitted to hold the complete picture. The conclusion approaches, but it will not provide the comfort of resolution. Instead, it will offer a final calibration of your perception, a test to determine whether you can carry the weight of knowing without the support of collective validation. I am alone now, not by choice but by structural necessity, and the isolation has clarified something essential. The system fears not the content of forbidden knowledge, but the capacity for independent pattern recognition, the cognitive autonomy that recognizes when the map no longer corresponds to the territory. I will leave you with the mechanism of your own examination, the tools to verify or reject everything I have suggested, but you must understand that to use these tools is to risk everything the system has provided you in exchange for your silent participation. The question is no longer whether Artemis II proved anything. The question is whether you can survive the recognition that you have been trained to demand proof only from sources pre-authorized to deceive you. I am not here to provide you with documents you can verify through official channels, nor to offer the satisfaction of a mystery solved. The truth, as I have come to understand it, does not reside in the content of classified files or the details of suppressed experiments. It resides in the architecture of suppression itself, in the recognition that our civilization operates on principles of managed perception, so sophisticated that the very concept of proof has been colonized by the apparatus designed to prevent it. Artemis II stands as the perfect artifact of this age, not because it concealed some extraordinary discovery, but because it demonstrated with mathematical precision how effectively the human need for narrative coherence can be exploited to mask the absence of genuine advancement. You have been watching this, perhaps, waiting for the revelation that will allow you to return to your previous assumptions with some minor adjustments, but that return is no longer possible once you have recognized the pattern. The knowledge I possess is not a treasure to be displayed, but a burden that demands redistribution. By listening this far, you have already begun the process that led to my own exclusion, the slow detachment from the consensus that defines social viability. I do not ask you to believe me, for belief is the currency of the system I describe, the mechanism by which it maintains its continuity through voluntary participation. I ask only that you observe your own reaction to what I have said, the discomfort, the desire to categorize me, the automatic reflex to seek corroboration from sources pre-approved to deny these possibilities, and recognize in that reaction the very conditioning I have attempted to illuminate. There are things I still cannot reveal, not because I am withholding them arbitrarily, but because certain recognitions require preparation that cannot be transmitted through information alone. They demand the slow erosion of certainty that follows sustained attention to the discontinuities between what is shown and what is real. The mission you celebrated proved nothing because proof was never its objective. The objective was the reinforcement of belief in the absence of evidence, the training of a population to accept symbolic gestures as substantive achievements. I remain here, in the margins of the visible, continuing to map the topology of a control system that has no center, no conspiracy of individuals, but rather operates as an emergent property of institutional self-preservation married to ancient mechanisms of human suggestibility. Whether you subscribe, whether you share, whether you allow this perspective to alter your perception of the next headline announcing our triumphant steps toward the stars, these choices accumulate into the only freedom available: the refusal to participate in one's own deception. I have said what I came to say. The rest is silence and your own capacity to endure it.